this fair? No, you're calling the score after the point is over. It's not like we're playing 1 point.
How is this fair? She asked quietly, not in protest, but in disbelief, after the point was already over. A moment so small, it should have vanished into the noise of the crowd, yet instead echoed across the stadium and far beyond it. Because this time, something felt different. This wasn't rage or collapse or drama in the traditional sense. This was silence. And silence can be far more unsettling than anger, because when an athlete stops fighting outwardly, it forces the world to look inward. And as the match slipped away, that silence grew heavier, each missed shot landing not just on the court, but on the expectations that had been stacked on her shoulders for years. Expectations built before she was old enough to vote. Expectations shaped by highlight reels, headlines, and a global hunger for the next untouchable star. And the crowd sensed it too, that subtle shift where applause turns cautious and gasps replace cheers. Because everyone watching could feel the momentum draining, the confidence fading, not in an explosion, but in a slow, quiet unraveling. And that was what made the loss so uncomfortable to witness, because it didn't look like failure the way we're used to seeing it. It looked human, fragile, uncertain. And for the first time, people weren't asking who beat her, they were asking what was happening inside her. And to understand why this moment landed so hard, you have to go back, far before this match, far before the fame, back to a child with a racket whose movement already looked too precise, whose focus already felt unnatural, whose coaches whispered that she was different before the world ever learned her name. Because from the very beginning, her story was about acceleration, not gradual rise, but sudden arrival. A talent that skipped steps, and by the time she was a teenager, the tennis world wasn't asking if she would be great, it was asking when she would dominate. And that kind of certainty from the outside creates an invisible contract, one where you're no longer allowed to struggle in public, where every loss feels like a betrayal of a future people already decided for you. And she handled it with grace, or at least what looked like grace. The practiced smiles, the composed interviews, the careful words, every gesture carrying responsibility not just to herself, but to fans, sponsors, commentators, and a sport eager for its next icon. But pressure doesn't announce itself loudly. It creeps in quietly, into hesitation, into timing, into the half-second pause before committing to a shot. And those moments don't show up on stat sheets, but they change matches. And over the years, as the wins piled up and the trophies confirmed the hype, the pressure didn't ease, it intensified. Because now she wasn't chasing greatness, she was defending an image of it. And that image left no room for nights like this, nights where the rhythm disappears, where unforced errors stack, where the body language tightens and the opponent senses it immediately and presses harder, exploiting moments that would normally be sealed shut by confidence. And as the match unfolded, the warning signs multiplied. A slightly off toss, a double fault at the wrong time, a forehand sailing wide when the rally should have ended cleanly, and with each mistake, the crowd leaned forward, not in excitement, but concern. Because this wasn't arrogance meeting punishment, this was a player expected to win, confronting the reality that talent alone doesn't guarantee control. And when the turning point came, that rally that should have been routine but ended with a shocking miss, the stadium froze, not roaring, not booing, just inhaling collectively, as if everyone realized at the same moment that this was no longer about a scoreline, it was about exposure, about vulnerability unfolding live. And she didn't scream or slam her racket or look to the box for answers. She nodded, breathed, and kept going, but the silence lingered longer than the point itself, and when the final game ended and she walked off the court with her head slightly lowered, the loss followed her instantly into the digital world, where nuance evaporates and reaction multiplies, where clips loop endlessly and body language becomes evidence, and within minutes timelines were flooded with disbelief, judgment, defense, mockery, sympathy, all colliding at once, headlines framing the moment as collapse, commentators dissecting every pause, every breath, asking whether this was a fluke or a fracture, whether composure had finally cracked under the weight of expectation. and fans split sharply, some reminding the world of her age, her achievements, the impossible standards placed on her so early, others demanding answers, questioning mental toughness, projecting fear onto a single night. And that's the cruel paradox of modern sports fame, where humanity is celebrated in theory but punished in practice, where we say athletes are human but react as if they've broken a promise when they prove it. And through it all, she remained quiet. No immediate statements, no defensive posts, just silence. And that silence became a canvas for projection, for speculation, for narratives written without her consent, while behind closed doors, a different process unfolded, one far less dramatic and far more important. Conversations that weren't about blame, but understanding, about recognizing that perfectionism had begun to outweigh joy, that the fear of losing had crept into instincts that once flowed freely, and instead of running from the moment, she'd faced it, returning to training not to prove dominance, but to rebuild trust in her game. Integrating mental routines alongside physical drills, learning to accept mistakes as information rather than threats. And when she finally spoke, the words were simple but revealing, saying she wanted to be better, not perfect, acknowledging that some lessons hurt more than others. And slowly the tone shifted, from collapse to reflection, from embarrassment to growth, because what people were witnessing wasn't the end of a rise, but the middle of a transformation, the part of the story it rarely gets glamorized, where a champion learns that greatness isn't defined by invincibility, but by resilience, by the ability to absorb scrutiny without losing direction, to carry criticism without letting it harden into fear. And as she stepped back onto the court again, there was intention in every movement, not desperation, but clarity, not avoidance of pressure, but acceptance of it, understanding that the spotlight will always magnify both triumph and struggle, and legacy is shaped less by flawless victories than by how one responds when the narrative turns, because this loss, once framed as humiliation, became a mirror, showing her and the world that strength isn't silence or noise, it's persistence. And whether this moment becomes a footnote or a foundation depends not on what happened that night, but on what follows. Because in tennis, as in life, it's never the fall that defines you, it's the response. And the story of Coco Gauff is still being written, not by headlines alone, but by the choices she makes when the applause fades and the work continues, quietly, deliberately, and with the kind of resilience that can only be forged under pressure. And what followed in the days after that match was not loud redemption or immediate revenge, but something far quieter and far more difficult, a period where the noise of the outside world clashed violently with the internal need to recalibrate. Because when an athlete reaches her level, failure doesn't simply disappear after the handshake. It lingers in hotel rooms, in late-night replays watched without sound, in the early morning practices where muscle memory feels just slightly unfamiliar, and every headline read, even the supportive ones, carries an undertone of doubt. And this is the part of the journey most fans never see, the lonely middle space between performance and recovery, where confidence has to be rebuilt without applause, where belief has to be reaffirmed without trophies. And for someone who had grown up under a microscope, whose career unfolded in real time before millions, that space can feel suffocating, because silence invites imagination, and imagination in the age of social media rarely leans towards patience. Instead, it magnifies fear, rewriting a single night into a larger question about identity, about ceiling, about whether early success was destiny or exception. And that question followed her everywhere, into training sessions where coaches noticed the smallest adjustments, the deliberate breathing before serves, the extra pause before committing to a shot, signs not of weakness but of awareness, because maturity in sport often begins when instinct alone is no longer enough, when talent has to coexist with control. And that balance is fragile, especially when the world expects dominance without evolution. But slowly, almost imperceptibly, something began to change, not in the results at first, but in the approach. The way she spoke about losses, not as threats, but as data. The way she framed pressure not as a burden, but as proof that she was still relevant, still dangerous, still someone opponents prepared for seriously.
And that reframing matters more than any highlight, because champions aren't built in moments of ease. They're forged in moments where belief has to be chosen deliberately, again and again, even when doubt feels louder. And as tournaments came and went, every match carried the echo of that night, not as trauma but as reference, a reminder of how quickly things can shift when focus fractures. And instead of fearing that memory, she began to carry it with her, using it to stay grounded, to resist the temptation of autopilot, to remain present point by point. Because when you've been publicly humbled, complacency becomes impossible. And in that sense, the loss gave her something victories never could: perspective, an understanding that greatness is not a straight line upward, but a series of recalibrations, of moments where the illusion of invincibility is stripped away and replaced with something more durable, something rooted in resilience rather than image. And fans, whether they realized it or not, were watching a transformation unfold, not a collapse, but a deepening.